Hello and welcome to another episode of KingstonCitizens.org's Roundtable. This is What's the Process? And we record and broadcast a program each week. This is number 5, where we discuss and tackle local City of Kingston and Ulster County topics with a range of guests. My name is Rebecca Martin. I'm one of the co-hosts, and I'm a co-founder and director of KingstonCitizens.org. And I'm with my good friend and co-host
Jennifer Schwartz Berky. I am also a co-founder of Kingston Citizens, more of an advisor these days. I am also an urban planner, and I was a county legislator for one term, and now I'm back in civilian life.
Yes, and I'm so happy that we can do this, especially in this time, just to kind of keep the dialogue going and talk about lots of different issues. And if you want to learn more about KingstonCitizens.org, you can visit our website at www.kingstoncitizens.org. And today's topic is titled Rent, Mortgages, and the Housing Crisis in the City of Kingston, where we'll also discuss the history of rent control in the City of Kingston with our guest, Alex Panagiotopoulos, who is of the Kingston Tenants Union. I believe he's one of the founders, and he'll be joining us shortly. Next week, we're going to start to get into some serious wonk, which is something that I know Jenny enjoys as much as I do. And we're gonna walk through a local law process and how that all works in the City of Kingston. I know that these processes can be confusing, I think even to council members. So it'll be good for us to take that on. But for tonight, we're going to discuss housing in all of its complications, and especially now in the time of COVID. And while we wait for Alex to join us, Jenny, I think it would be great if you could give us a little context tonight. If you can, in a few minutes before he comes on.
Well, when you're talking about housing, inevitably, especially in declining, smaller sort of what we refer to as legacy cities or even Rust Belt cities, if you think about these older cities in the United States, Kingston is an example of that situation where at one time it was thriving, there was a lot of industry, and as those things left and went offshore, including IBM, but even long before, we ended up with a situation of essentially the creation of an inner city, however small that was, and the creation of a sort of neglected housing stock that was the result of disinvestment. And a lot of that disinvestment was, in fact, very specific, deliberate policy that created a form of spatial segregation. So Kingston struggles with that legacy, and some refer to it as redlining, but there's a lot of other causes for it besides the mapping of segregated space and the difference in access to credit. There are also local policies and good old boys, so to speak, and slumlords, and a lot of things that contribute to the housing crisis that we now face in many cities like Kingston, as well as probably all over the United States, given the mortgage crisis of 2008. So it's really not just cities. No one is immune at this point, given the distribution of income and the disparity of income and wealth in the United States. So that's kind of the big picture. But there are very specific policies that cities take on, and Alex is going to talk a little bit about that and what it tried to do to combat the need for housing, especially in the wake of World War II. Is there something else you would like me to add to that, Rebecca?
Well, I was looking at a presentation that Alex put together more closely, which is a series of newspaper articles from 1955 through 1977, which
Mm-hmm.
we'll display a little bit here, I'm sure, at some point. So much to cover, but it really struck me because we are now, we're on the other side of all of that, and there was rent control, and there was a lot of opposition towards that, and to decontrol rent, and prior to urban renewal in downtown, and then the displacement of the community members in downtown to midtown, and perhaps in other surrounding towns like the town of Ulster. There was even a form of land banking at that time where the city was trying to take over multi residential dwellings that had fallen into disrepair. I mean, it's really wild to be on the other side of that now, and to see and to have witnessed or have the history of urban renewal and what that meant, not only to Kingston but throughout that time period. And Alex is here, so why don't we let him in and get started on these topics. I know I just kind of left you hanging. And maybe you want to say a little something before we bring him in.
I just wanted to say that, yes, we are on the other side. If you want to go ahead and let him in. But what I was going to say is, and he might as well hear it. We'll welcome him first. Hi, Alex.
Welcome, Alex.
Hey there.
Hi, we're recording. We're just sort of rounding down here our introduction. So Jenny wanted you to hear this last point. We were talking about your articles that you put together from 1955 to 1977, and how striking it is, at the similarities in some ways, and being on the other side of that now, to look back and to have that as a reference point. And Jenny was going to summarize.
Yeah, and I had summarized very briefly the sort of big picture history, but when you think about post-World War II and the housing boom or the need for housing, I should say, that took place all over America, whether it was because of sprawl and industry moving here and families growing, don't forget it was the baby boom time, and into the era where the government thought it could actually intervene and solve these problems with urban renewal, which, as we know, again, what Rebecca says, the other side, was a massively ambitious social engineering effort, which if we even look in the Rondout and you watch Lost Rondout, the film, you can see that it was a failed experiment, and it really destroyed neighborhoods and communities. But just in terms of Kingston as a microcosm, these things have been happening all across the country in very similar ways. And now we're at a time where government barely intervenes in housing. And I think that's a really important place to sort of pick up at the end again when we talk, because I think if government has to intervene in some way, it would be valuable for us to think about what that could be given its limited resources.
Yeah, it's a great thing to round up on. And Alex, we introduced you earlier, but I'll do it again. We have Alex Panagiotopoulos, who is of the Kingston Tenants Union. And Alex, you are a co-founder, or maybe the founder. Maybe you can give us the co-founder of the Kingston Tenants Union. And,
I was there when it started. Let's put it that way.
Well, why don't you tell us about your organization and start there? About the Kingston Tenants.
Well, it's just a group of people. Yeah, I mean, it's just a group of people that are organizing in a grassroots way. So we're not a nonprofit. We're not seeking any kind of funding. We're just a group of people that are noticing what's going on, and we're trying to, outside of the government, outside of all the nonprofits in Kingston, we're trying to give people education and support to organize themselves. So
sounds familiar.
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of similar.
When did you begin, Alex? When did you start working with the Kingston Tenants Union? And why did it come about too?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me personally, and it's not all about me, but my personal journey to get there was that just over the years, I've always lived near Kingston in the Hudson Valley. And and just over the years, like different things kept falling apart for me. Where, for a long time, I believed that, since IBM left, that the only thing we needed was to get more jobs, more investment, and then everything would be good again. And then that started to fall through. And then, I was listening to politicians and nonprofits and government, and they were saying that we need to attract people here, and that's going to lift up all the boats, and we need to bring all this culture to Kingston. And I believed it. I totally believed everybody. And then around 2017, 2018, and my partner Fox and I started noticing and talking to people that most of the working class people that we know in Kingston were having a harder time living here, even though they had just done so much work to make things nicer and better. We just weren't seeing the benefits kind of filtering down to everybody. So in 2018, I started getting more involved. I spent a lot of time. I spent way too much time on the gentrification group on Facebook, because I kind of naively believed that there was a way to like reason with the people in power, and you explain it to them enough, and you put enough information and data and stories in front of them that they'll change their mind, and that they'll spend more of their political capital to make things happen. And that was naive of me. So then in late 2018 and 2019, the Kingston Tenants Union started happening, and there were a number of things involving the Kingstonian, and then some tenant struggles that we supported, that were things that were, as opposed to how I used to approach things, which was like, we need to reason and work with everyone and collaborate with everyone. These were more confrontational and, confrontational and, trying to call out the contradictions inherent in so much of like what daily life is in our community. So that's what we've been doing. And then in 2020, we had gotten a good number of dues paying members. People can pay as little as $1 to join the tenants union. But when COVID hit, we moved mostly to online stuff. So we are supporting. There is an active rent strike going on right now with a building in Kingston that we're supporting. And other than that, we're working with various people out there who have reached out, and we'll see where those things go. But we're helping people form tenants associations in their buildings so that they can get their needs met by their landlord. Because even though there's a lot of, the county level, the local level, the state level, there's lots of resources and funds and things that people can apply to and places they can report things. At the end of the day, like, those are very limited. So we're trying to help people take control for themselves by forming an association, getting their demands met. And then if the demands don't get met, then, we've built up a pretty good media platform where we could amplify that struggle out there and just make it untenable for the landlord to keep neglecting the tenants. So that's my life story.
Can you tell people your domain name?
It's KingstonTenantsUnion.org.
Okay.
Jenny, I find two questions.
And you have resources?
Oh, I think he said there's membership.
Yeah, I mean, we have a bunch of, so people could become members, but right on the website we just have we have a slideshow, we have videos about, and a Google Doc about how to start a tenants association. So even if someone wants to just read that stuff for their own benefit, they don't have to reach out to us. They can take that in.
Mm-hmm. Where, Alex, are you are you able to relay what building is in Kingston is in a rent strike at the moment? Is that public knowledge or not? it's more of a process?
Not yet, but we're waiting to see what happens with the demand letter. But yeah, there's someone doing it.
You're on mute, Jenny.
What kinds of demands do tenants make when they do this sort of strike?
Well, right now, it's about illegal construction going on in buildings. Landlords are showing apartments, even though the law says not to. Workers are coming in and out of buildings, not wearing PPE, endangering the tenants inside. Things like that. And then also, in terms of the landlord not being as aggressive as they could be in seeking like some of the funding that's out there, or the stopgap measures that are out there for landlords. Some landlords are just saying, you owe me the rent no matter what. I don't care that you're laid off and you can't get unemployment. So there's some of that too. So there's a financial element and there's a safety element. And those are the two main things right now.
Alex, do you remember about a decade ago, and Jenny too, and you might even be able to fill in some of the gaps here, is I remember there was a study that had been done, I believe, by at the police chief at the time, Jerry Keller, that was talking a lot about gentrification in the Midtown area. That was followed by a 2011 election, I remember, where there was an affordable housing project at the King's Inn, where all 4 or 5 of the mayoral candidates were not in favor of it. And I'm not sure the connection or the timing of that at that time, but I wonder if you might recall it in your research, and Jenny too, and what your impressions of that are now, and maybe what the impressions at the time were from talking to people from that time period. And that affordable housing project you and I discussed, was it, I don't know if I said it or not, but it was the King's Inn site at that time, which is right next to UPAC.
Yep.
Well, it
Jennifer,
was about 10 years ago.
I'll let you go first on that.
Oh, well, it was about 10 years ago, and at that time I was working with what was forming as a bid in Midtown Business Improvement District, and we actually held a charrette, a sort of design workshop with a number of design professionals and members of the community.
Was that at 721, Jenny? Was that one at 721?
No, well, yeah, that's right. It was at 721 Media Center. And I had been working with Pat Courtney, for a few years at that point. She and Nancy Donskoy were working on a study with a couple of professionals who have sort of had Main Street background at the time, and thought they could help us develop a business improvement district for Broadway. And it was at that time that Keller came out with this notion that we really need to gentrify Midtown. It was a different use of the term. The idea was if we could mix in some market rate housing, it would stabilize the neighborhood. Those are actually concepts that in some sense are debatable, but there are various sides to this argument. It is not by any means just a sort of a dichotomous thing where if you have very low income housing, then you don't have gentrification. And if you have all high income housing, then you do. The most stable neighborhoods are actually the ones that tend to have the slowest turnover, and they tend to have, and also greater density generally, but we can get into that later. And I'm sure Alex has a lot to say about that. But the point that Chief Keller was trying to make was, if only we could add market rate housing, we would stabilize the neighborhood. And so he was using the word gentrification in a sort of fuzzy, old-fashioned use of the term. It's now seen as a much more divisive and corrosive issue
Was it a notion or a study? That's what I'm not clear.
No, he wrote a 5-page sort of outline of what, it was not a big report or a study. It was much more of a sort of looking at crime statistics and making some comparisons, I believe, with other communities and taking some of the police literature that he was familiar with. That's my understanding of it. But it was not the same thinking that has crept into the discourse in the last decade, in which we are seeing enormous numbers of people coming up from the metro area and a lot of warehousing of properties from short-term rentals and or weekenders, Airbnb and so on, and really actually taking a lot of properties off the market. Not to mention after 2008, and then I want Alex to talk. There was a lot more housing went into receivership or became zombies, held by the bank. And so we're dealing with a lot of vacancy, which is also corrosive and does not help the housing stock. So that's kind of a nutshell overview. I'm very interested in getting into what Alex is thinking about in terms of gentrification from the point of view of the tenants union. And also this little analysis, not little, it's actually quite beautiful, this assemblage of articles that you brought to us, because I'm wondering what it tells you about our story.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, right. I mean, 10 years ago feels like, well, more than 10 years ago at this point. I can't even, amazing. So, I mean, a lot of things have changed and, but a lot of things are the same. So I wasn't old enough I was old, but I wasn't old enough. I didn't care enough yet to really know like the significance of that. And looking back, like I'm hard pressed to find people other than Hudson River Housing, which brought the affordable housing proposal. Chris Silva from the Bardavon also was a big advocate for the affordable housing project.
Mm-hmm.
I have a hard time finding other voices, but that's filtered through the newspaper. In hindsight, it looks like we could have used that housing because it takes like 5 years just to build something. Really could use it, especially seeing like what's going on in Midtown now. But at the same time, there are obviously larger issues with housing that, even if we built that affordable housing, some forces in the city would have enabled forces to go even more aggressively with things that take away housing and all that. So yeah, I mean, it is interesting to look back at that proposal. I'm not going to name any names, but seeing some of the voices that are still active in the housing discourse today that were against that project and what they've moved on to opposing. There are people today that say that they support all forms of housing built everywhere, including affordable housing. They say that now. At the time, they were very against that project, and then those people have shifted into being dead set against rent control. And what they say is, well, we need to build affordable housing. So I don't know, but and it's part of a much longer story, which is what I alluded to. I think Rebecca reached out to me because I had commented on something, a photo from the 40s or the 50s from what's considered Kingston's heyday. So I don't know. I can just spring into that, or unless you wanted to say something, Rebecca or Jennifer.
I do. Sorry, I am actually.
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm bringing this up, but before we launch into this, because I think that what I notice is that in the community, when there's real debate on affordable housing, is that there seems to be a misunderstanding between what affordable or workforce housing means versus what Section 8 housing means, what market rate housing means. And that matters, right? What are they? What are what's affordable housing, workforce housing mean? Versus, and then what is Section 8 housing? And in general, if you don't know the exact definition, just to be clear with listeners as we launch into your wonderful presentation here.
I mean, Section 8 is it's vouchers basically. So, RUPCO administers the Section 8 program in Ulster County. It's a federal program. They have a set number of vouchers that they can give out that help make regular housing affordable for people with low incomes. Not sure how many vouchers they have. I know that there's always a huge wait list. And even if you win the lottery to get the housing voucher, it can sometimes take years before you actually get the voucher, by which time a lot of people are gone. So, I mean, the voucher, and the guy that wrote Evicted, Matthew Desmond, he's a huge believer in vouchers. He endorsed Michael Bloomberg because Bloomberg proposed a massive expansion of vouchers. The thing about and the thing that people in KTU and ideologically some people say about vouchers is that it's a subsidy for landlords. It doesn't address the fundamental power imbalance between tenants and landlords. It's basically, and some lords actually prefer to get Section 8 vouchers because right now those checks are still coming through, whereas many other tenants don't have income and can't pay. So there's that. There's a set number of vouchers. There's public housing, which is owned by the government and is criminally underfunded everywhere and in New York State. A lot of people that, including me, I think that we need a lot more public housing and we need to fully fund it by taxing billionaires. And then there's affordable housing, which, as a group like RUPCO or Hudson River Housing, they are nonprofits that know how to work the system of grants and tax credits and adaptive reuse and all that kind of stuff to create, some number of affordable units. And that's based on a formula based on what the median income is of an area. And then there's just regular housing, market rate. And most of the housing in Kingston is market rate. So the last time we looked, I think that there's about 6,000 rental units in Kingston. It's a majority renter city. About 6,000 rental units, about 1,200 are considered subsidized or public housing. So either like they have tax credits to keep them affordable or they're owned by the government. And then the rest are all market rate, which makes them subject. Some of those market rate units probably have Section 8 vouchers going to them. I don't know how many, but the vast majority of units in Kingston are completely unregulated, market rate, no protections for tenants.
Yeah, and that is a good segue into, and well, let me just say that therefore market rate housing means that whatever they can afford, whatever they can charge for them, right? Whatever the market will bear. So,
yes.
Thank you for putting together, first of all, this is my favorite sort of thing. I love timelines and looking back at the history of Kingston especially. And what you did here is you put this together for us to be able to understand that at one time there was rent control in the state, of course, but in the city of Kingston. And I think that there's 17 frames here. I'm sorry, there's 22 frames here that tell a story. So we don't have time to get into each and every one, but it would be great to give an overview. And there's a little context. Each page has a newspaper article on the subject, and we watch the city of Kingston go from having rent control to it being decontrolled. at a time where urban renewal was being introduced and IBM is coming into the area, and where the downtown community was, through urban renewal, displaced and moved to Midtown. The city was taking over derelict buildings and, in a sense, doing their version, I think, of a land bank, at that time. It's just really powerful to see, much of the same story today, well, in a different sort of way, sort of playing out, that we are essentially not really prepared, either in the 1950s and now today. As Jenny likes to say, it's Groundhog Day, and it's really true on so many of these topics. So do you want to walk us through this a little bit, maybe 5 minutes or so, and we'll make this available to the public and attach it to the video so that others can really dig in like we've been able to do.
Yeah, and the lens that I looked at this stuff was that over the last year, we were fighting to get the Emergency Tenant Protection Act passed in Kingston, and really having a confrontation with not only the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, but the Kingstonian, having a confrontation with landlords and the government that there's a lot that happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s that set the stage for what the power dynamic is today. So 1955 is when, I'll take it back. If you go back to the first slide. So 1942, the federal government introduced nationwide rent control because there was an emergency. With the war going on, all kinds of goods and services or mostly commodities, were put under some kind of control by the government in a wartime economy. So that included in Kingston, we had about 3,400 apartments that were put under rent control. And this was before most of the public housing and subsidized housing had been built. There wasn't much of that time. It was mostly market rate. And then in 1955 is where we kind of pick up with this. So it had been 12 years. Rent control was one of the few controls that lasted after the war because it was so popular. And also, the context of the 1930s, it was the era of the New Deal. There was militant organizing going on that was really confrontational, and to kind of quell those, we got all kinds of protections. So rent control was one of them. In 1955, so it had been 12 years at that point, there started to be rumblings because the real estate industry had really been organizing for a long time to undo rent control, because it really hurts their ability to to see the fluctuations in land and rent, made it harder for landlords. And in 1955, also IBM was coming to Kingston. So one of the really funny things is one of the go-to lines is that rent control and fighting gentrification is going to slow down the investment that comes to Kingston. But the greatest economic development win of all time, or at least in American history in our area, was IBM coming, and that happened while we had rent control. You can go to the next one. So yeah, in 1955, there started to be action by the city. I guess what happened was the state became in control of the rent control stuff because the federal government was starting to shut it down. New York State kept it going, but it became an opt-in. And I believe in 1955, the mayor at that time, I don't know if his name is here, the mayor at that time was
It was Garrigan.
Strang. No,
Yeah.
I think it was Stang in 1955.
Oh, yes. Okay.
It was
Yes,
Mayor
Stang.
Frederick H. Stang.
It was Stang.
Garrigan comes later in the story.
Mhm.
I'll go back, but I just wanted to show you.
So the Stang man was in support of rent control, and he urged the Common Council to renew it, which is really cool. And you can see some amazing quotes in here. Here's a quote from, I think it was a council member. He said, if rent controls were lifted in their entirety at this time, or even partially, a chaotic condition would exist that would be infinitely worse than the burdens that retention of controls may bring upon property owners. If controls were abandoned, some poor folk would find themselves without a place to stay at all. It is much easier to prevent this, if possible, than to attempt to cure the situation later on. That was 1955. And then if we go forward a little bit more, something changed that is not in the newspaper, and I'm not sure what happened, but something changed. You can keep going. The 1956, I think this is what changed, was that urban renewal was on the horizon, and the case was starting to be made by the government and in collaboration with some of the business associations and real estate, that we needed to do urban renewal. And the interesting thing is that the debate at that time wasn't whether or not to do urban renewal, it was whether or not to do public housing along with urban renewal. Because there were groups in the city that, like the Ulster County Real Estate Board, that wanted the urban renewal to happen, but not the public housing, which is wild. And, they were the main force that was opposing our bid to get rent control in 2020. 60 years ago, they were fighting public housing, and the public housing that made urban renewal only slightly more bearable than it was. The fact that some public housing was created was like a tiny offset to what happened. But yeah, you can see that they were buying ads in the paper at the time, vote no on public housing. So interesting.
And this is exactly what you just said, that there was the Ulster County Real Estate Board favored urban renewal, but opposed public housing. So I'm not sure how they were thinking about it in terms of where people would live.
They were thinking about it as a cash injection to their interests. Urban renewal was really framed in social terms, but it was really it was a deal of the power elite. It was not really philanthropy. Let's put it that way.
And they clearly had a lot of power, and you can imagine today that you have that sort of a force behind an initiative. It can really diminish the voices of others, and I think we see that going forward with the opposition.
Yeah. And
not a single voice was raised in opposition to decontrol of rents.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if we skipped it or if I forgot to include the slide, but there's a clip from the mid 50s, right before this stuff happened, where someone from the real estate board statewide came to Kingston and encouraged local realtors to get involved on the planning board, the zoning board, and to lend their expertise to the matters of city government.
I think that's later, actually. I think
okay,
I recall
that's
that
later.
Coming up, yeah.
Excellent. All right.
So shall I keep going, or?
Well, I'll just say really quick here. So 1957, something, because urban renewal was on the horizon, I think, although it doesn't say. Somehow it just became really quickly, they decontrolled rent. They held a public hearing. In other towns, there were reports of really raucous hearings where tenants and landlords were both passionately making their case, like in Poughkeepsie that happened. But in Kingston, the hearing was very orderly. It says here in the article that 100 property owners packed City Hall in the Common Council chamber. 15 landlords testified. Some of the quotes, if people want to read this later, some of the quotes are wild, where, they're saying the cost of living, inflation went up 15%, but my profits remain the same. Whereas in today, since 2000, median, the rent has gone up by 50%, but wages have remained the same. So you can see like back then, 15% was just too much to keep rents controlled. Whereas today, we're orders of magnitude beyond that, and we can't get it passed. So you can keep going. So yeah, so this is just saying that they're decontrolling rent because nobody spoke out against it. Two aldermen were very cool about saying a strong quote, saying why we really needed rent control to protect our seniors, our vulnerable people. But
it looks like
then
the two that you're talking about were actually absent from the vote. It looks like in this article it says a 9-2 vote with two aldermen absent.
oh, well, then it says two dissenting were
I
Herschel
see.
Mays and George
I see.
McCardle,
Okay.
both Republicans, surprisingly.
So this is where you're moving up to the state here with your clippings.
Yeah.
What happened? So in Kingston, this is happening in tandem. No, it's 2 years later. So it looks like. So what is the relevance of this? I mean, it's 2 years after Kingston was decontrolled. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, 2 years after, people in other parts of the state were still fighting to keep their rights. And looking at, I only included this one just to show that like it wasn't over yet, but things ended basically in 1974 when they passed the original Emergency Tenant Protection Act, and there were various versions of that. But eventually what they settled on to make it really hard to pass was that it only applied to certain kinds of buildings after a vacancy study, and it only applied to certain towns in New York State. But basically there were, between 1960 and 1974, there was an ongoing battle going on that, as far as I can tell in the newspapers, like it wasn't, Kingston wasn't really part of that, although people were talking about urban renewal in Kingston and talking about the problems that urban renewal caused, and also about the resulting slumlords that took over Kingston after urban renewal. I can't really find people talking about rent control after that time, all except for one notable example that we'll get to. So yeah, this is 1967. So some great quotes here from Leonard Van Dyke, who was the first black alderman in Kingston. But he was calling out the mayor's lack of interest and inaction in what was happening to Rondout residents that were getting relocated and moved into crappy conditions.
But by now we have a new mayor, right? So by now, serving in the city of Kingston was Raymond W. Garrigan, a new mayor. So just want to note that. Garrigan Drive, right? Named after probably the mayor that bypasses the Rondout. That was an urban renewal move. Yeah?
Yes.
Then if you go to the next one, so in tandem with urban renewal and so I guess like the larger thing that's going on here. So in the move to get rid of rent control and adopting urban renewal, we're moving into a new era of financialization of housing and treating housing as a mode of profit rather than a mode for the community to be housed. So what we're seeing in 1967, so the conditions in Midtown got really bad. At the time, I think it was called the 10th Ward, which is today Ward 4. But yeah, tenants held a huge protest at that time. And then something called the Neighborhood Action Group was formed at that time. And they were pushing for, a pushback against slumlordery and the housing code violations and stuff.
This is significant to me too, because this is displacement right here, right?
Yep.
From downtown to Midtown. And
Yeah, it says too that the committee feels that many of the houses were in bad shape previous to the large influx of former downtown residents and have deteriorated further in recent months.
Well, and also there was a lot of discussion in there about there being really no incentive for the landlords or the slumlords to maintain any of these properties. First of all, it seemed as though the building department wasn't really doing its job. They were getting away with holes in the walls and pretty sordid conditions, but they were charging whatever the rate was because no one else would take them. So as if they were pushed into this, and we refer to this concept as blockbusting, where that whole section of town was bought up, was devalued and bought up by slumlords. Franklin Street is the one in this story, but it happened throughout Midtown.
So something interesting that happened here, I don't know if much came of it, but at the time, Mayor Garrigan, there was kind of an over my dead body kind of moment. So he said, if the landlords won't fix these places up, the city will. And they passed a law that the city would take over rundown properties and rehabilitate them, and then collect the rent on the property while it was getting fixed up, and then they'd give it back to the landlord. Garrigan admitted that there'd be a loss of revenue to the city, but it was better to lose revenue on a few buildings rather than on an entire block. So that was pretty cool. They did it on one building, but I don't see any mention of this ever again. So I guess it wasn't successful, but seemed like a pretty strong thing to do. So in 1970, there started to be this guy named Jack Goldstein, we have Goldsteins today. They own E&M Management, and they own Stony Run and some of the big apartment complexes, but no relation. There was a guy named Jack Goldstein who started buying up tons of property in Midtown and also the town of Ulster, and he was very notorious for saying racist things and building code violations, which same problems today.
Well, to be fair, the building departments of today are a very different creature than they were back then. The use of codes and the strictness, let's say, of New York State in being able to crack down on violations is, I think, a little bit more in hand. At that time, it seems like it was pretty rampantly flouted. But I don't know if that was widespread or only in these slums or slumlord situations. Do you know? You get a sense that they were letting slumlords get away with it, but not anyone else?
I mean, it only made it to the paper once it was like a widespread problem. So I saw this in Midtown Kingston. There was another article a couple that I found in Ellenville at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But you can see here, this is a great story from 1977 that really shows what was going on. And, this is like, this is basically like what's happening today. This was, I think one of the slides, maybe I didn't get it in time. There was another one where I believe it was Everett Hodge at the time. During
I didn't see that. I would love to have that. We can amend the.
Yeah, I'll get that to you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But so before this, this guy, John Gilmore, who I believe passed away recently, he moved away for a while. He was calling out in his role as the head of the Human Rights Commission about the conditions, because there was a racial element as well, and big time. But also Everett Hodge earlier before this, I think several years before this, was calling for rent control, citywide rent control during urban renewal, because there was just so many problems. There was so much price gouging going on, and he was calling for a number of other emergency measures that didn't get passed. But cool to see these people stepping up.
Yes.
I have a question. I didn't notice this, but was Goldstein local, or was he from outside of the community?
It said one of the articles says he lived on Pearl Street,
Okay.
but I don't know. I don't know what his history was. It looked like I've seen him like in the paper from like the 50s to the 70s, so he was here for a while. But
Okay.
he really made an impact.
Also, you have to remember a lot of people moved up here from the metro area in the post-war years. So local is a relative term.
True.
So here you have with all the violations that the city seemed to have come to the conclusion that most were not violations. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what the article says, but that's what Goldstein's attorney claimed. But it sounded like there were some pretty serious problems.
Yeah, well, this is great. And anything that you want to add to it, drop it in and we'll share it when it's
Yep.
done.
I can get that in.
That would be really great. And thank you so much for this, Jenny. What do you think?
So I was wondering if I know that you're following that you had brought some proposed laws to the Common Council. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that, and because this show is about what's the process, so we'd like to help listeners become involved in any way that they wished to, in advocacy or any other part of the process that they want to learn about. So can you tell us a little bit about ideas that are either finding their place into the Common Council and have some traction maybe?
And actually, before you answer that, Alex, can I run through my understanding of the current legislation in the City of Kingston to have
Sure.
you give some more background, more than we have, and maybe clarifications.
Mm-hmm.
We know that, I guess I'm going to start with evictions, because it seems like that was the first thing that kind of came on our radar, where Ulster County was promoting no evictions before the statewide eviction protection occurred. And that the state extended evictions for 3 months, and I'm not sure when that began. And maybe that intersected with the county. That was the gap that they were trying to fill before the state came down with their executive orders. But the reason why they're putting in eviction, promoted no evictions, was so that those who had lost their income weren't thrown out in the midst of COVID, right? And it sounds like there was a real discrepancy with mortgages, that there's a difference between the federal mortgages, the Fannie Freddie mortgages, versus everything else. And so the time frame initially was June, everything else, and July for the federal loan. So it wasn't really equal, and that the state recently was able to extend both types of loans, federal and otherwise, comprehensively through August the 15th. And so with that said, maybe you can clarify if there's anything missing from my understanding, and also how are banks that are not federal banks complying with this that you're aware of? Start there.
Oh. I mean, well, I don't know if you said a lot of. Did you mention the 3-month extension that Cuomo did recently?
Yeah, through August the 15th, as I
Right.
understand it. Where
Yeah.
both federal and otherwise mortgages were together here. I think that they were staggered before. I'm not sure why.
Well, yeah, and the problem with the 3 month extension is that there's so many gaps in that. There's tons of exceptions, and really, like, people are going to start getting evicted on June 15th. Um,
Why is
that's
that?
simple. Because if you look at there's an infographic that we shared on the KTU page, but basically, there are a ton of exceptions to the extension that were made. I don't know them exactly, but yeah, basically, it's like, oh, were you in arrears before March 15th? Yes or no? Was there already an eviction proceeding going on? Uh, did you, did you not pay during the 3 months? Like, there's all kinds of things going on. So it's not as clear cut. I mean, it's even more complicated. Basically, what I'm saying, it's even more complicated than it
Than
even
that?
was
Yeah.
than the like discrepancy between federal and state. Um,
But we did learn that all forbearances aren't created equal. That's been my personal experience, that the federal loans are being allowed to not pay and to just add an additional year or however many months
yeah,
that they are not paying, whereas everything else is due, I think, at the end of the forbearance, which is 3 months, maybe 6 months. Maybe it's, I don't know how those are being handled. And then the amount that wasn't paid is either owed back immediately following the forbearance or set up in payments that would be stacked on top of your regular mortgage payment. So it seems, very complex. And, the two laws, as I understand it, in the city of Kingston, um, that have been proposed. One is local law number 3 of 2020, but it actually says 2019. So I think that needs to be fixed. But it passed through the Laws and Rules Committee in May. And it was a special Laws and Rules Committee meeting that was held before caucus in May, and then went to the floor. So it was a local law. Went to the floor for its first reading, where there's no debate. They read it into the record, and then they let it sit until the following month, which is June, where it'll go to the floor for a vote. So there'll be public comment. I'm sure there'll be council debate. And then I think within 10 days, it goes to the mayor for a public hearing, who then approves or denies the law, and then it passes or it doesn't. And I'm sure it will. But the background to this is that it's an amendment to local law section 332-3 of the landlord legislation that went into effect in 2019, where landlords register their properties to the building department, building safety department. And this would now require landlords to also report their mortgage, their bank, whether it's a federal loan or otherwise. And once the law is enacted in June, I guess the building department has 15 days to send a notice to the landlord. So that would be by July. But there's no directive for what happens next. Like, the landlord has a certain time period to comply. There's no language that outlines that. There isn't any detail of how the renters will get that information, and what the renter is supposed to do in the midst of a crisis to advocate, I guess, their landlord and say, hey, you have a federal loan, therefore you can add time to your loan, so therefore you don't have to pay your loan. And I'm just popcorning here, just proposing. I don't know what they expect, but I think it's a heavy lift for someone to advocate to their landlord to not pay their mortgage and to give them rent free until their forbearance comes to a conclusion. And with evictions being lifted as of June 15th, as you say, and then certainly by the 15th, it's totally unclear whether or not the federal loan or the loan aspect of this law will even be enforced to provide relief. And I just don't understand what the city of Kingston has in mind for making this work, and now we're in the midst of it all with evictions coming up. So what is we're going a little longer today because I think this is so important. Jenny, do you agree? Do you mind if we're going over our time?
Oh, I agree to go over. I don't want to say we are doomed, but it certainly seems
No,
like
but
for breadlines, the sort of
I think it's
proverbial, we're in worse shape than we were in the Depression at this point, but I don't know how quickly it will bounce back. And so I guess the question is, in wrapping up, how do we activate citizens to participate in?
well, but wait a second. This is only one law. There's two.
Right.
So I would actually like to know Alex's. That's why I mean going over, because I do want to cover both laws, because this really is important for the community to understand what's literally coming up and how these laws can be better improved. I'm not sure. So Alex, do you have any thoughts on what I just outlined there for this legislation that's literally in the midst of its local law process?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said, I think you nailed it when you said this expectation, this idea that a tenant is going to be able to say, "Hey, Mr. Landlord, you could apply. I can't pay the rent, but you can apply for this kind of relief." The dynamic in Kingston is that the landlord wants, if the tenant is not paying right now, the landlord wants them gone as quickly as possible, because there is you can list an apartment right now and get 50 responses from people who are ready to pay like 3 or 4 months in advance.
Right. Our vacancy rate is effectively zero.
Yeah, I mean the Ulster, yeah, and the county just put out another housing report, and yeah, our vacancy rate is like 1% or something like that. Yeah. But it's even worse. I mean, it's even worse now. And we talked to people, like Fox was just talking to someone today who's having a situation, where it's the landlord is in the position of selling the place, and this tenant is in a tough spot, and they're looking for housing, and there's nothing out there. They have dual income. They make like, I think 2 people, they each make 35,000, and there's nothing. There's literally nothing. And these people already are living in like horrible conditions, and their kids, I think their kids are here, so they want to stay, but it's. So yeah, so I mean, basically, like this idea, this notion of anything that either requires the landlord to be like, to decide to do the right thing, or anything that requires the tenant to apply for something, are both ripe for huge gaps in exploitation, because right now the market is saying that you want the tenant out as quickly as possible, and just get the person out, because you can lock someone into a lease right now for way more money. Or two, when it comes to, I mean, I think the second thing that you're going to bring up is the memorializing resolution in support of the voucher program.
And I know it sounds bleak, but I do want to, I want to walk through this, but I also, I'm giving it away, but I do want us to be thinking about what could the City of Kingston do, Ulster County do, that actually would be effective. But let's walk through the memorializing resolution. The second piece of legislation that's being put forth, which is memorializing resolution number 84, that supports emergency rental assistance. I think it passed in April or May of this year, and it endorses, the City of Kingston endorses 8140, which is the number, I think, of the legislation for the state that was introduced by the US Senate in March. So they're rental assistance vouchers for defined periods of time to those who can provide evidence of hardship due to COVID. I'm only smiling simply because I know there's got to be such a limited number of these. I don't know how this works. And a memorializing resolution, as we know, is not law. It shows support for something, but I'm not sure how this helps the community at large. So what are your thoughts on this, that the past and that there was a lot of cheering over, but how does this help us?
Well, so I mean, the thing about that memorializing resolution, I mean, someone that I really respect was like pushing for that, and it's about sending a message to the state that that rent isn't just a New York City problem; it's a statewide problem. And I respect her judgment, but the memorializing resolution was for the compromise already. So there's a statewide movement and a bill in the legislature to can't simply cancel rent and mortgage payments for the duration of the crisis, and to say that during the eviction moratorium, you can't get evicted, and at the end of it, you don't. If you couldn't pay, you don't owe anything. The state will make everybody whole by taxing billionaires. Um,
That's
and
on the
that's a
table
bill.
now. That's in front of the state legislature now.
Well, I mean, it should have been. It was blocked by Cuomo and Andrew Stewart Cousins, but
Really?
because Cuomo is, basically owned by the real estate industry. So the compromise, which was supported by the city, was this voucher system, which would make landlords whole if the tenant is able to apply, if the tenant is a documented citizen, if the tenant makes a certain amount of money, if the tenant goes through the process, if the tenant fills out all the forms and sends it to the right person with all the I's and T's dotted and crossed, which is very different from a universal program, which ensures that there are no gaps.
So it was helpful in some way
Kind
to
of.
pass this, in your
Well,
opinion.
yes and no, because it was kind of rolling over, in my opinion, because what's happening now is that the legislature says, oh, well, that's the starting point. So we're going to whittle this down to make it even worse for tenants. So what's going on right now, and there's reporting out today about this, that the legislature is doing something that's about 1/10 of that program that was endorsed by the city. That takes, I think it's only funded for $100 million through the CARES Act. And it's something that's severely means tested, doesn't cover public housing, doesn't cover undocumented people, doesn't cover people that can't prove their income, which is true for a lot of service industry and gig work type people. So it's kind of a mess. So I really would have preferred if they endorsed canceling the rent, but that's my opinion.
What do you?
Also,
Yeah, I'm
sorry,
sorry,
no, I was
Jenny.
just going to say, also, it sounds like you're saying that people need to know an awful lot to even begin to sort out what they can or cannot do, right? So I think, just if I might, is there a role the city can play? I know you're doing a great deal to inform those who visit your site, but is there a role the city can play in that gap, that knowledge gap?
Yeah. The city, the city and the nonprofits that deal with people and populations and communities that are affected by this, they could use a very small amount of money to launch campaigns to help people figure this stuff out.
Right.
I'm honestly dumbfounded that this hasn't happened already. Like legal services, RUPCO, Family Woodstock.
What about family? They have not.
I mean, there's various there's various things that are like geared towards every nonprofit's services, but in terms
Okay.
of an informational piece, the thing is, like, it's always going to be out of date because things are constantly changing, especially now. But yeah, I mean, definitely, like there are definitely authorities that could be investing a little money and a little thought into getting people into these programs.
I
It's
think
not
though,
really, yeah.
it's really a bucket full of holes when you think. Just you said Family Woodstock, and I immediately think about all the programs that they have, for instance, and during COVID, just getting people food. I think even the number of children who still are hungry, it's an enormous burden on the community to try to figure out all of these problems. So, or to in the midst of this, where nobody is really prepared. So, are you suggesting then that wherever it comes from, that there needs to be a push to educate, but not necessarily in line with the current legislation, because it's not, or maybe it is, but what sort of education are you talking about that follows what's happening in the state, that's following, that's the confusing thing, is that they're all sort of following one another, but I can't imagine that Kingston has a whole lot of authority of setting the pace. I mean, since a lot of, it seems to me, what has to be done with mortgages, et cetera, is not something that the city can actually determine. So what sort of education are you imagining in the next
Well,
couple of minutes? Because it sounds like that's what you think is a silver bullet.
well, no.
No?
Well, I'm only saying that because it's something that should be done, but it's not. I don't think it's the solution. But if all these groups are truly like for the things that they say they're for, they could be doing more, I think, or they could be asking for money to do more in this area. But the thing that one thing that I'm following closely, that I hope there's public news to share soon, in Ithaca, the tenants union there is collaborating with the city government to cancel the rent locally. It would be a landmark thing. That I guess they have some really strong allies now in the city council there. So I'm not sure how they're going to do it, but they are working on canceling the rent locally there, because it is like I said, like the marginalized groups that we all believe are like the lifeblood of our cities, the people that live in public housing, the people that are undocumented, the people that can't document their income. They're going to be left out by these vouchers. So finding a way to cancel the rent would be the number one thing. In terms of process, could the city find a process to do that? I think they could, but I don't think that we have the right people in there that would be willing to go through that process and spend the political capital that would be needed. So I guess I mean, in terms of on a positive note, I know this is about process, but I believe, and the thing that keeps me going with Kingston Tenants Union is the fact that people figure out the process once they see the need out there. And I tried for a while, I tried to do it with like data and stats, but what we really need to see are tenants organizing themselves and confronting that no one's helping them and no one's got them in mind. I mean, we all, like, many people are sad about it and all that, but what we need to do is support tenants that are going to be stepping up publicly to say that they can't pay their rent. They're going to get evicted in a couple months, and people that care need to say, like, you know what, we need everyone to be able to stay in our community. And I support, even though this person is refusing the help, the charity help, or this person is refusing the relocation assistance, I support this person in staying in their home, because it's not their fault that there's a global pandemic. And it's not, go ahead.
I keep wishing.
I'm rambling.
Not at all. It's wonderful stuff. It's very thought-provoking, and it doesn't have to be positive. I mean, this is the reality, and I think that's what we need right now, is the reality. And part of what I've been thinking about and wishing is that there were a way. If I could have my wish, it would be that communities like Kingston for a year would have what they needed. And in return, they have to commit inward to their community, and that there was a system somehow for us all to work together as a community to solve what are these massive gaps, that people don't have housing, that people are hungry, that people don't have access to healthcare or to, appropriate education at times. I mean, these problems are only going to be solved in the way that you're suggesting, that in the way that I'm hearing it, is when the community as a whole is working on solving those problems. And the only way to do it, and I think the pandemic has brought forth with unemployment insurance, which is not easy to get, and this pandemic funding is $600 a month, it equals, at least it shows you what's possible and give the community a chance to go inward and to work on these problems. And it sounds Pollyanna, but I don't see how one elected body is going to do this, pull this off. And I prefer to take steps to bringing the community together rather than some major revolt. I mean, what is that going to look like? If people don't have what they need, then what happens? And so I think that's what I've been thinking a lot about. Jenny, what about you? And why don't you round us off here? It's a lot to round off. And
there's so much. I mean, this whole idea of mutual aid and people showing up to help, understanding that it's not just about the temporary and the food, but a very deep structural defect that we have to say no to from now on, that we have to do so much more. For instance, I'm troubled by the lack of a short-term rental law. I know it's only one among many, but it's one of those things where you have to say it's time to step up. Hundreds of municipalities throughout New York State, including at least half a dozen in Ulster County, have already passed theirs. What are we waiting for? Kingston has become a super hot destination, and it has become a place where people who think it's cheap to buy up a house and warehouse it and keep it for weekends and rent it out for exorbitant rates that cover their mortgage, and wow, isn't that cheap for them? But it's taking housing off the market, and it's creating a real, almost like a local pandemic of housing crisis. And I am frustrated that we've talked about it now for at least 6 years. Because I remember it being coming in when Alex and I were walking around Ward 7?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember hearing that.
Or 6, yeah.
Let's just say I remember hearing about campaign promises when we were both running for office together in 2015. It's a little bit too long when there are models available from all over the state. And what my concern is that when I look at that's our story arc of those articles, that this is going to be again, like I said, Groundhog's Day. You have people very entrenched interests protecting themselves, not wanting to see anything change at this point. What I would suggest, Ulster County has just passed two resolutions, one for a housing action plan. Now, I'm a planner, but this one is supposed to be a listening tour. We need to get a lot of people out there to shout from the rooftops or whatever it is, the sidewalks, for Ulster County to really pay attention to what is needed to get not only people into affordable rentals, but help them build their wealth as residents of the community. I bought a duplex because it was the only thing I could afford. And when my parents were growing up, that was how you built your wealth. That was a different time. But there's a way with incremental and small scale development that we can help people get into flexible types of housing and maybe even build some equity of their own. That's the only way this is going to work going into the future. We need to tell them that, and we need to get the land bank working on it. The land bank is going to expand into Ulster County, and we need to get involved in that. So if there's anything I would say, get the city to pass a short-term rental law. It shouldn't hurt owner occupants, but it should not allow warehousing. And I'm sure that the Tenants Union has a lot to say about that. We could talk about that at another show. And then get our voices heard on those Ulster County housing action and land bank efforts.
Yeah, and Alex, you'd said something earlier that really, I understand it, but I so want to see that turnaround too, that working with elected and appointed officials and getting involved in the process, that it was naive of you to think that that would actually work. And that is an Achilles heel for me. I really believe that democracy is something that it requires participation, and that it's a very hard moment for that, for many of us in different ways. But I do hope that you'll keep going, and we will keep going. And we'd love to have you back, and you're wonderful. And thank you for all of your work. And
Thank you.
Yes, your website is a tremendous service, I think. It really provides great background. So you haven't stepped away, and I don't think you're naive anymore, and never did, actually.
Yeah, I wish I was more naive, actually.
Well, thank you so much for everything you do, and I hope that everybody listening will visit KingstonTenantsUnion.org.
Org.
And thank you, Alex.
Bravo.
Yep.
Thanks.
Thank you,
and
Alex.
We'll see you next time.
Best of
Good night.
luck.
All right. Thanks. You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.